Okay, welcome to Chapter 2, everybody. This is a screencast for Chapter 2. Wealth and Power, the Bias of the System. This study of social problems requires a critical examination of the structure of society. Some readers will find this approach uncomfortable, maybe even unpatriotic. This chapter is divided into three sections. The first describes the U.S. economy with its concentration of corporate and private wealth. The second examines the political systems and its link to economic elites. And finally, the final section shows how the political and economic system is biased in favor of those who are already advantaged. Adam Smith-style free market with competition among innumerable small competitors was how capitalism was first envisioned. Capitalists responded to the demands of the market. The U.S. economy, however, has always been based on the principles of capitalism. However, the present economy is far removed from a free enterprise system. It's now dominated by huge corporations that, contrary to classical economic theory, control demand rather than respond to the demands of the market. Capitalism has problems. Karl Marx predicted that capitalism was doomed by several inherent contradictions that would produce a class of people bent on destroying it. The most significant of these contradictions for our purposes is the inevitability of monopolies. Marx hypothesized that free enterprise would result in some firms becoming bigger and bigger as they eliminated their opposition or absorbed smaller competing firms. For the most part, the evidence in U.S. society upholds Marx's prediction made 160 years ago. Less than 1% of all corporations produce over 80% of private sector output. Shared monopolies. Most sectors of the U.S. economy are dominated by a few corporations. Instead of one corporation controlling an industry, the typical situation is domination by a small number of large firms. For example, if we looked at the telecommunications industry, there are probably 4 or 5 mega corporations that control publishing, cable TV, satellite TV. They own networks, they own entertainment venues, and so forth. So a mega merger occurs. This is a process whereby these giant companies are formed when big firms combine with other big firms to create even bigger firms. For example, AT&T and T-Mobile were going to merge. I think the antitrust laws kept that from happening, but that was on the possibility there. Comcast and Time Warner have been talking about merging for years. There are negative consequences to mega mergers. First, they increase the centralization of capital, which reduces competition and raises prices for consumers. Second, mega mergers increase the power of huge corporations over workers, unions, politicians, and governments. Third, they reduce the number of jobs. Fourth, they increase corporate debt. And fifth, they are non-productive. Elaborating on this last point, mergers and takeovers do not create new plants, products, or jobs. They create profits for the chief executive officers, lawyers, accountants, brokers, bankers, and big investors. It's kind of fictional capital. The economy is dominated by what are called interlocking directorates. These are arrangements that have great potential to benefit the companies by reducing competition through the sharing of information and the coordination of policies. A direct interlock is when the individual serves on the board of directors of 2 companies. An indirect interlock is when 2 companies have a director on the board of a 3rd company. If you Google interlocking directorates, and I'm not asking you to do that, but you might want to do it and take a look at the number of individuals running the vast majority, 80–90% of the economy, you're going to see that about 400 individuals basically run the entire economy, not only of the United States, but basically of the world. The process of economic concentrations provides the largest companies with enormous economic and political power. ABC Disney is an example of a media monopoly. The globalization of largest U.S. corporations makes corporations' power all the greater. The fact that international economic life has very important implications for social problems both at home and abroad. The consequences of this shift in production from the U.S. to other countries is significant. Most important is the reduction or even drying up of many semi-skilled and unskilled jobs in the United States. This leads to increased welfare costs and increased discontent among people in the working class. Another result is the concentration of power and internationalization of corporations as the enormous power held by transnational corporations. The largest corporations control the world economy. Their decisions to build or not to build, to relocate a plant, or to start a new product or scrap an old one have tremendous impacts on the lives of ordinary citizens in the countries they operate from and invest in, and on their disinvestment in U.S.-based corporations. Transnational corporations tend to meddle in the internal affairs of other nations to protect their interests and maximize profits. These activities include attempts to overthrow governments considered unfriendly to corporate interest and payment of millions of dollars in bribes and political contributions to reactionary governments and conservative leaders in various countries. The other discrepancy between free enterprise and the way things are is its real and ideal states is the ultra concentration of wealth among a few individuals and corporations. Corporate wealth is centralized in a few corporations, and the concentration is only increasing. Less than 1% of all corporations account for 80% of the total output of the private sector. 1% of all food corporations control 80% of all the industry's assets and almost 90% of the profits. 6 transnational corporations ship 90% of the grain to the world's market. Private wealth, on the other hand, capitalism generates inequality. Wealth is concentrated not only in the largest corporations, but also among individuals and families. The combined net worth of 400 richest Americans in 2011 was more than the total wealth of the bottom 185 million Americans. The United States also had the largest number of ultra-high net worth households, worth 100 million or more, and 365 billionaire households. The convergence of income is such that the statistics are more dramatic when looking at wealth, but the convergence of income is still highly concentrated. In 2010, the share of the national income of the richest 20% of households was 50.2%, while the bottom 20% received only 3.3% of the nation's income. Another measure of the increasing gap is the difference in earnings between the heads of corporations and the workers in their corporations. These policies have 4 major consequences. First, they exacerbate the unequal distribution of wealth in the U.S., which has already had the most unequal in the Western world. Second, huge tax cuts occurred at the very time when the U.S. was conducting 2 costly wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and spending huge amounts to get the country out of the greatest economic disaster since the Great Depression. The result, a dramatic increase in the national debt. The now increasing debt is used to justify reductions to government spending and programs that help the less fortunate, and it weakens public institutions that benefit society. It represents the increasing political influence of the wealthy in the United States. Especially noteworthy is a sharp gain in the Gini index, which measures the magnitude of income concentration from 1970 to 2010. Please read this definition of the Gini index. It's informative, and it's used in many ways to measure income equality or inequality in a society.